Hi everybody! Welcome back to AP Psychology with me, Miss Baines, your teacher, where you are able to pause and rewind me as I deliver you our latest content. So go ahead and grab those flare tip colored markers, a nice comfy space in which to work, and of course, don't forget those ever important binder notes that go in lockstep order with this video. Unit 8, Video 5, Neurodevelopmental Disorder, on pages 10 and 11. I'll see you on the other side. Hello and welcome back to another set of video notes for AP Psychology. As you can see from today's learning targets, neurodevelopmental disorders in our clinical psychology unit are a group of disorders that involve distortions in development, hence why it's called neurodevelopmental, right? But they have recently added with the DSM-5 the neuro part because there is such a genetic basis for it. Remember, neuroscience is biology, the body. So the genetic basis, then it's something biologically altering that has happened, whether that was in utero while the woman was carrying the fetus or some kind of environmental factor that affected or impacted the fetus. However, it is neurologically impacting the now person, right? So it distorts the development of basic psychological functioning that is involved in, say, social language skills, perception, motor skills, behavior. These usually get diagnosed within our infancy, right? Something's going on with the baby that's not quite right, and they can't put their finger on it. So this usually occurs or is diagnosed during infancy or early childhood, or maybe even adolescence. The first big one that we should talk about is called autism spectrum disorder, also known as ASD. The autism spectrum disorder, and there has recently been some changes in the DSM-5 here. But typically, people who have this diagnosis show an unusual pattern of social, okay, that's the big part of it, right? The social aspect. There's social deficiencies. The social cognitive development beginning in childhood with marked difficulties in social interactions and communications. Okay, it's actually kind of like the real big one, which is an indicator that pushes the parent to kind of dig in a little deeper and see what's going on with their child. Things like making eye contact, not really seeking out or even liking affection from the parent, even with their own mom, right? That's a big one. So social interaction is huge on the spectrum. It now includes the highest to lowest functioning individuals with characteristics of autism. So the biggest change in the DSM-5 was that with the spectrum disorder, and now it's a much wider spectrum, including at the high end being Asperger's syndrome, and with the onset age before 3 is normally when you start seeing characteristics. Usually much earlier research had shown that if autism spectrum disorder was, quote, caught earlier in younger children, there would be more success in the treatment of as they got older. 4 to 5 times more likely in males than females, and about 70% of autism spectrum disorder also have an intellectual disability. Please understand that what I'm saying right here is that the intellectual component is not always there with all autism spectrum disorders. And that's why there was a big reason why it is a spectrum, right? A continuum. There's a high end of the spectrum, and then there's less of, you could say, intellectual disability over here. It's more social and more about communication. And that's the kind of thing. So some characteristics of impairment and social relationships are that they showed a noticeable lack of awareness or even existence of feelings of others. They may not like to be touched or held. They avoid eye contact. They prefer solitary play. Right? They'd rather play, like make a puzzle or something, than play with their sibling. About half of all autistic children do not develop speech, meaning they do not speak at all. And speech is often an echo of what is heard. So if speech is developed, oftentimes it's more of an echo, whether that be of what other people are saying, like they parent their parents, or of movies that they watched or listened to something on the internet, right? On the autism spectrum, they'll hear something once and be able to repeat it back Exactly. It's very interesting. There's a very narrow range of interests and activities in kids that are diagnosed. They get kind of fixated on what it is that they really like and what they're comfortable playing with. And they may focus on certain objects almost obsessively. And this is a big one. The last one is there's this thing called sameness. Right? Routine. Very important. Usually these kids will become distraught and even angry if there's any kind of change that occurs in their usual day-to-day routines. Oftentimes you'll see in school districts that the administration who is trying to orchestrate or kind of administer, right? Like stuff like that, they'll be really openly communicating with special education teachers who have those students on the spectrum because they know that change, right, in routine is really, really hard for them. So they will try to alleviate that as much as possible and give those teachers a heads up when the drills are going to occur so that they can work in a calming down period for those students. Okay, if it's possible, most engage something called self-soothing behaviors in order to block out the extrasensory information that they do not seem to have a filter to be able to block out. Something that could be overwhelming to them, but is irrelevant if there's no selective attention. So the self-soothing could be like rocking, right? They'll rock back and forth as if they were in a rocking chair. Okay, that they kind of look and behave as if they have some tics, almost something that is soothing to them, right? So you should know that there's lots of research and there's a lot of controversy over what the causes of autism spectrum disorder might likely be. It's likely that it is a combination of both genetics and the environment playing a role in a diagnosis, which is the case for most things, right, that we have talked about. Researchers identified a number of genes that have been associated with the disorder, and studies of people with autism spectrum disorder have found irregularities in several different regions of the brain. There have been abnormal levels of serotonin and other neurotransmitters in the brain. So there very much is a biological component to obviously understanding the neurodevelopmental part of this child. The next one that we need to talk about is called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or you may know it as ADHD. Okay, this developmental disability that involves having a short attention span, easily distractible, and extreme difficulty in remaining inactive for any period of time, so not moving, right? Not being able to sit still for a very long period of time, not being able to focus for things like story time or stuff where everybody's meant to be quiet, right? The better known of this disorders that we'll be talking about when there's a good thing, right? The advantage to having this, right? You want to make sure you have the terminology and the vocabulary to write about it and to speak particularly articulately, not just emotionally. And it kind of comes from this common sense point of view because we're talking about people, right? We want to be able to articulate what is happening when they have this disorder. It is estimated to affect 3 to 5% of school-age children, and there are some subtypes within this disorder, and it's not necessarily that you really have to know the subtypes, other than that these are characteristics that fall underneath this umbrella, okay? The hyperactive impulsive, the dominantly inattentive, and then combined hyperactive impulsive and inattentive. We'll look at each one of these, okay? So those with inattention as being easily distracted, right? They miss details and forget things frequently, switching from one topic or activity to another because they're not able to keep their focus on something long enough to become truly interested in it, right? They become bored with that particular task and move on to something more exciting. After a few minutes, if they do not become engaged unless they are doing something enjoyable, they can't force their focus. It has to be something that naturally draws them in, right? And something that they want to hone in on. They have difficulty focusing attention and organizing or completing any given task that they're not into doing. Okay, even learning something new can be a nightmare for these kids because they don't know if it's interesting yet. They have trouble completing or turning in homework assignments after losing things like a pencil or a pen, right? Toys. Assignments need to be complete tasks and activities that they don't seem to listen to when spoken to, and then there will be like no eye contact and physically appearing to listen, but they're not hearing what's being said. Right? Oftentimes they are the daydreamers of the room and become distracted easily by what's going on outside the window. These kids also have difficulty processing information as quickly and accurately as others. So they're not able to kind of keep up with the pace. They struggle to follow instructions because of the same reasons. Hyperactivity. This one being pretty self-explanatory, but they kind of squirm around in their seats, they get fidgety, they talk a lot, they're dashing around, getting up and down from their seat, going from one place to another, touching with stuff on the desk, playing with anything, twirling, everything in sight, right? They play and twirl and move and pick up everything they can find in their sight. They have trouble sitting down and being still. They're constantly in motion, right? It's like this physical component, the hyperactivity, but it's also mentally draining, right? Having difficulty to do the quiet task or the puzzle or the math problem. And then there's this impulsivity, this being impatience, right? So they blurt out the inappropriate comments or showing their emotions without restraint. There's not a lot of control there, and they act out without any regard for the consequences, whether it is because they know the consequences and just don't care, or they think it's not worth it or worth their time, so they just forget about them. Having difficulty when they are waiting for their turn in a board game, for instance, they will often interrupt the conversations or other people's activities with a lack of compassion or understanding that they should be the ones waiting to go next. They might be some causes in research that points to a combination of both genetics and environmental factors within the treatments. Okay, treatment often involves administering stimulant drugs. Something that you might have heard of is called Adderall, Ritalin, Concerta. These are interesting because if you think about it, this is like a speed drug, right? And if you're already hyperactive and you're taking the speed, it would be unusual, right? It's anti-intuitive because it's a prescribed stimulant. But they actually improve the symptoms of people with this disorder because it has a paradoxical effect, an opposite effect on people with attention deficit or hyperactivity disorders. It flips the script and the stimulant becomes something that helps them to focus better. I don't think I'm the only person telling you that these drugs have been overprescribed so much in the last couple of decades, and so much of our student population are just given these drugs when they end up making them act out even in a worse way because they don't actually have a precise diagnosis. Okay, so when somebody actually has ADHD, the stimulant actually improves the symptoms of the disorder, having a calming effect, right? Many, though, have adverse side effects, but in a minor way, they have those opposite paradoxical individuals with ADHD may have other disorders, like a learning disability, or something called oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, which we talked about, anxiety depressive disorder, or even bipolar disorder. All right, when there's a secondary diagnosis and there's another thing to worry about, right, there's a correlation, a relationship, not a cause and effect, but the symptoms of one may take another more noticeable severe and just perpetuate the other one. And the two of the ones that we just listed that we're going to talk about again. But back in our personality notes, right, if you kind of go back in time and look at the personality notes, you would find the personality disorders that we talked about, such as antisocial personality disorder, oppositional defiant, and conduct disorder, which is antisocial disorder for children. Okay, if you want to go back to those and make some additional notes about this, when it's in concert with the diagnosis of ADHD, it can be what is a living nightmare for not just the person with suffering from these diagnoses, but the people who love them and have to live with them and try to find a way to harmonize. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more here in depth about oppositional defiant disorder, ODD.
The ODD behavior, it typically starts around the age of 8 years old, but has been seen in some children as early as the preschool years of 4 or 5.
Okay, there are symptoms, and they must last for 6 months at a time and become more than, quote, childhood misbehaviors, because it's defiant disorder. So these children aren't just misbehaving or acting out or testing us. Their misbehavior is constant. It's going on in a more than normal type of day-to-day misbehavior. They don't follow adults' requests to not do things that they're doing wrong, right? And you just gotta realize with this disorder, their minds are angry and resentful of others. They argue with adults and blame other people for their mistakes. A big one is that they lack the ability to make strong friendships, or they lose their friends easily because of the characteristics and being in a constant state of disarray or rage, right? They're in constant trouble at school. They're constantly losing their temper, being spiteful, seeking revenge, blaming others, not owning up to what they do wrong. They become revengeful. They get very touchy or easily annoyed, throw temper tantrums, and mentally, the pattern of behaviors must be different from those of other children that they are around of the same age, right? The same age and developmental level, right? That changes the amount that a child, quote, normally misbehaves or normally reduces or changes into different types of misbehavior. In development, the behavior is thought to be caused by a combination of both biological and psychological and social factors, right? That three-pronged approach. A lot is going on there with conduct disorder, right? A lot has been associated with things like child abuse, so family conflicts, genetic defects, poverty, parental drug addiction or alcoholism. The diagnosis is more common among boys, and children with conduct disorder tend to be impulsive and difficult to control and manage. They are unconcerned about the feelings of others. They lack the ability to have empathy and guilt or remorse. So when they do hurt somebody or trip somebody or kick somebody or hurt their feelings, they have no sense of feeling bad about what they've just done. This should be sounding very familiar because we saw it with antisocial personality disorder in adults, but we can't diagnose somebody with that diagnosis until they're 18 years of age. But the symptoms are very similar that happen with children in conduct disorder, as a child at least finds oftentimes symptoms of being antisocial behaviors. And I'm going to say it again because students trip up on this. Even I trip up on this sometimes. Antisocial, right, does not mean that they don't want to be around other people. It means that they probably shouldn't be around other people because their behaviors are anti-promoting social interaction. They do bad things in social interactions. They bully, they fight, they break rules and bones, right, without any apparent reason. Their cruel behavior is often towards not only other people, but they turn their aggressive behaviors when they can't make friends towards animals or people, or they hit people with dangerous weapons.
Forced sexual
activity, mugging or purse snatching, destruction of property. They deliberately set fires, they break and enter properties that don't belong to them, they destroy other people's stuff, they do it on purpose. They also have a tendency to be heavy drinkers and use illicit drugs heavily, or prescription drugs as well, right? They're lying to get a favor and running away. Insurance, beginning before the ages of 13, and vandalism. Children with conduct disorder may go on to develop personality disorders on top of the other diagnoses as well. As adults, we talked about particularly antisocial behavior. If their behaviors get worse and worse as they get older, these individuals might also develop significant drug and legal problems, right? So now they become part of a bigger system. They're following down that really bad path in life. Okay, that wraps up our neurodevelopment disorders. Thanks so much. I hope that helped you to understand some of those disorders, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye now.